stopped before the spiral and I watched it pass. And that was the moment that shifted so much for me, because for the first time in my adult life, I proved to myself that I could be trusted. Hello and welcome to another new episode of Emotional Eating Unwrapped. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, and there is a strange thing that happens when you have been struggling with food for a long time, right? Like you get to this place where you're not confused anymore. You're not ignorant. You're not out of control in the way people imagine. In fact, you know exactly what you're doing, and you can even see yourself doing it while it's happening, right? For example, you are standing in the kitchen eating leftovers 30 minutes after you finished eating. You go downstairs at midnight to get a snack, even though you technically should have been sleeping an hour ago and maybe even were sleeping an hour ago, right? You get to the point of feeling super, super stuffed. You eat to that point, even though there was a point in your brain, like an hour ago or however long ago, to be like, I don't really need food anymore. And there's the part of you that is also almost like this witness above that's watching the whole thing and asking you, like this, devil on your shoulder, like, why am I still here? Like, why am I still doing this? And that's the part that doesn't often get focused on when we start to search for solutions to change the pattern. What we hear oftentimes and what ends up being focused on is solutions to change the symptom, right? Which is like something that makes us feel bad about ourselves, right? So it's like, just eat less, just stop eating when you're full, just have more willpower. And people say this to you as if you haven't already tried that, as if you haven't already been disciplined, right? As if more effort is the missing piece to this whole thing. But real change, right? Moving from this feeling, this experience and dynamic with food and eating to another one, which is healthier and which is more in service of your self-value and your body and weight goals. Right? Real change doesn't come from finally being more disciplined or more strict or even having more information about the issue, right? Having more information about nutrition. That's not consuming more. That's consuming more information, right? Getting more instructions, things like that. Like that doesn't move the needle usually. What I notice moves the needle, what I realize for my own self, and that's what this episode is going to be about, moves the needle. It comes in the moments where you decide to see what's really happening, right? Where you slow down the movie of your life and realize that there is an inner experience that is driving this relationship with food and eating, therefore leading to these symptoms and feelings and circumstances that are causing you suffering. The reason why I want to bring this up and the reason why I want to talk specifically about this is because these moments are not dramatic, right? They're not like huge overarching moments. But when you decide to see them and realize that these moments are opportunities, something clicks, right? When you choose to see these moments as opportunities for a shift, you can't unsee it afterwards. And oftentimes, finding that shift in small moments ends up being the biggest change lever that you could ever have. And so for me, there were three that I'm going to bring up today. And these three moments, they cracked my relationship with food open so wide in a way that, no diet, no rule book, no therapist even ever really did, because again, this is all about using your life experience as a way to transform, your behavior and your life. Talk therapy doesn't do that, right? When we talk about our lives, it's very different than observing ourselves within our lives. And that's the key difference. Okay, so I want to walk you through my three today, not because my story is special in any way, but because I think you might see yourself in them and you might have similar things that go on in your life that you think, that maybe you haven't you haven't seen before, you haven't related to before as an opportunity to see how maybe it's informing your relationship with food. So now when it happens to you in the future, you hopefully will maybe see it and be able to transform something within your life as well. Before we move in, if you are new to me, I want to introduce myself. My name is Alana Kessler. I am a registered dietitian, functional nutritionist. I've been in this health, this wellness space for 20 plus years. I've done all the things, holistic, clinical, but my passion is really helping people really find love with their body, reconnect with themselves, lose weight if that's a goal for you, overcome any kind of emotional or addictive patterns with food, and just really live your best life, because the most important thing. So if you are here and you are new, welcome. If you are a longer time listener, welcome back. And let's dive right in. All right. So my first moment was the night I realized that food wasn't the problem. Okay. And this moment happened sometime in like around 2006. I was about 25 years old and I was putting my shoes on to go to the Graciti supermarket. If you live in New York City, that will sound familiar to you. I was living on the Upper West Side of New York City, right by Central Park. Such a gorgeous area. Cannot believe I was so lucky to live there at 25 years old. Amazing. Graciti's was like a block and a half away from my apartment. So I was putting on shoes to go to the supermarket and get some of my comfort foods, like, ice cream, muffins, crackers. I was a big sweet mouthfeel type of girl. And it wasn't because I was hungry, but it wasn't because I was hungry. It wasn't because I had even decided that this is what I wanted, right? This wasn't like a conscious decision, but it was really because I didn't know what else to do with the feeling that I was having at the moment, which was that I wanted to jump out of my skin, right? And I'm sure if you're listening to this, you likely have had that sensation before of just wanting to just escape from your body. See, because I had just gotten off the phone with my mom and, nothing technically went wrong with that conversation. It wasn't like there was a big yelling match or there was no big conflict. It was just one of those moments where you talk, where you're talking, but it feels sort of procedural, and I felt more alone after, I wasn't really understood. My lifestyle has always been a little bit alternative from my family's lifestyle. So oftentimes after these conversations, there would be this kind of emptiness that I would feel. And it would almost feel like I was phoning in a sense of connection. And it was sort of this built-in type of thing. It was sort of just something that, like I said, procedural rather than actually feeling it. And the second that the call ended, my brain went straight to getting food from the supermarket, right? Just taking the action and getting food from the supermarket. So I went, right? I had a certain feeling of anticipation, of energy, right? Of momentum. I got the food. And when I came back, I ate the food, right? I wasn't even tasting it. I was just sort of going through the motions, chewing, swallowing, ultimately looking back now, realizing that, it had nothing to do with hunger or my stomach or anything. And then this is the point of the story. Mid-bite, I had this thought that I finally let myself kind of just wake up from the numbness and the whole thing and say to myself, I don't really want this. I woke up from the fog and I was just I don't really want this. I don't want the food. I don't want this binge. This whole energy arc of the binge is not what I want. I definitely don't want the aftermath of this, right? And what I wanted was to feel okay, right? I wanted to feel seen. I wanted to feel accepted. I wanted to feel like I could let go of the tension that was so heavily weighing on me. And food was the only tool that I had. So I kept eating, right? I kept eating, even though I knew better. But here's why this moment mattered. Because for the first time, I didn't attack myself for it. I sort of kept eating while also bringing this mindfulness to it, which is kind of odd to say because I feel like it would be better, not it'd be better, but it was you almost assume that I'd be like, and then I stopped. But that's not always realistic, right? It's not always realistic to have an awakening and stop immediately in that moment. It's more realistic to have an awakening and take that awakening with you, kind of have this moment where there's an overlap between the awakening and the behavior at the same time. And so that's what happened to me. But what was so important was that I didn't attack myself. I didn't spiral into negativity, like self-punishment. Like, what's wrong with me? Why do I always do this? I suck. Like, I'm such a mess. Like, I'm such a disaster. My life's going to be terrible, right? I noticed that I was using food to regulate something I didn't have another way to regulate while I was still using the food, right? And I think it's really important. I want to be really honest about that because that is a part of the healing journey, is where both things happen at the same time, okay? And the noticing, though, that gentle awareness, me allowing myself to both notice and also not force myself to change anything, was the crack. Because once I could see it, I stopped asking myself, like, how do I stop eating so much? And I started asking myself, what am I actually hungry for? Like, what am I trying to fill? What am I trying to satiate? And that question was the question that changed the direction of my whole life. It's a question that I still ask myself when I get urges, right? Now, I'm not saying that I never find myself like mindlessly, walking to the kitchen to get some food. And I don't know how many years later, 18 years later now, I still go back to that when I ask myself like, okay, what am I actually looking to satiate now? Okay. And so that question changed the direction of my whole life. All right. Moment number 2 was the night I realized that I could feel the urge and not follow it. Okay. So this second moment happened around the same year, I believe. And I was at an Italian restaurant with my friends. There was a bread basket on the table. And at this point in my life, bread wasn't just like a normal food, right? Bread wasn't just food. Bread was dangerous. Bread was, a precursor to chaos, most likely. Bread became the proof that I couldn't control myself. I couldn't be trusted. And I had spent years in this relationship with it where I would avoid it. I would negotiate with it, right? I would promise myself I'd have just like one roll, one piece, whatever, and then end up, eating many more than that and hating myself for it later. So when the bread basket came out at this dinner, I had that familiar conversation go on in my brain, that familiar tightness in my chest, the, mental gymnastics and calculation started going immediately, right? Like counting the calories. What if I have this? Saying like, oh, if I eat it, I'll lose control. If I don't eat it, I'll feel deprived and I'll end up like, buying an entire package of rolls later and eating it later. But then something different happened at this dinner. A thought showed up that had come before, but I've definitely had this thought before, but the way that I responded to it was different. So a thought showed up that said, what if I just have one roll? But I went further, not as a test, not as a cheat, not as a plan to make up for it or restrict again tomorrow. Like, what if I just had it because I wanted it and then moved on? Right? Because what I realized was in all those other times with the bread, I never had admitted to myself that I wanted it because I was afraid that the wanting would overtake me. But this time I was like, what if I allow myself to feel this wanting? And so I did. I took a piece, I ate it slowly, I let myself taste it, and then I stopped, right? And I stopped not because I was forcing myself to stop, not because I was being good or anything, but because I told myself I was going to have one, I enjoyed, and I genuinely felt like done. But that's not the point of the story, because right after that exact moment, I did feel the urge. After that, at some point, the urge that had become so unconscious, second nature, I felt the urge. That familiar whisper in my body that said, you could just keep going, right? This is usually where it turns. just have one more, have one more. And then we can go back into our regularly scheduled routine of binging and doing all this stuff and then starting over and like the whole thing that's so familiar, right? I could feel the old pattern trying to wake up, right? The compulsion of it all, the part of me that used to take over without asking. And I think this is the part that a lot of us are afraid of. But for the first time, I didn't panic about this, right? I didn't panic about the urge. I didn't panic about the loud, obnoxious bully in my head. I just noticed it. And I realized something that I didn't really ever realized before as possible for me, because this noticing widened my capacity to feel the urge and not obey the urge. And it wasn't because I was using willpower. It wasn't because I was like strong arming myself in any way, but it was because I had chosen to go down a different path with my conversation and relationship with myself. The old urge was an old operating system, but I was downloading new software applications into it now. I stayed with the discomfort of this urgency rising up in my body, and I watched it pass, right? I stopped before the spiral. I stayed with the discomfort. I stopped before the spiral and I watched it pass. And that was the moment that shifted so much for me, because for the first time in my adult life, I proved to myself that I could be trusted. You've built a good life. From the outside, it looks like you have it all together. You eat clean, you work hard, you take care of everyone, but there's this one area that still feels impossible to master, and that is food. You can eat perfectly all day and still end up in the kitchen at night wondering why you keep doing this. You promise yourself you'll start fresh tomorrow, and I know you mean it every single time. But the cycle, it always finds its way back, especially when you're stressed, when you're overwhelmed, or when you're just tired of being the one that's holding it all together. And I get it because I lived that way for years. And what I learned is this: the problem, it was never about food. It was the pressure underneath it, the perfectionism, the self-doubt, the part of me that never felt safe and secure to just be me. And that's why I created the sober eating sequence. It's a proven 3-phase method that rewires the emotional patterns and the belief systems driving overeating, so you can relax, trust yourself around food, and release weight completely naturally, without force and without obsession. Because when your body feels secure, it lets go. The cravings quiet, the self-punishment, it softens, and food, it stops being the thing that you have to fix. This is not another plan. This isn't another rule book. It's a revolutionary transformation for your nervous system, for your body, and for your identity. So join the sober eating movement today. My body wasn't really the enemy, that I wasn't a passenger in this thing with food, right? I had spent so many years believing that the only way to stay safe was to follow rules, to strong arm myself into things, right? It had to be all or nothing, right? It had to be like totally just control or screw it. But that night, it taught me something different, right? That trust isn't really trust with myself. It's not built through demands on myself or punishing myself or swinging between one extreme to the next. It's built through the capacity for permission, right? Permission to let myself want, and then permission to let myself have, and then permission to stop, right? None of these things are wrong. And when I gave myself that permission without guilt, without punishment, I didn't spiral. I felt secure. I felt stable. Okay. All right. So before I move on to moment 3, I just want to remind you that if you are enjoying the podcast, we want our podcast to reach as many people as possible that are struggling on their own. And the way to do that is by you guys who are listening, giving us 5 stars on Apple, on Spotify, and leaving a written review, just sharing how much the podcast is impacting you and hopefully enhancing your life, because when you do that, the algorithm is like, yes, this podcast is having amazing conversations that are changing the lives of people, and we want to go and push this podcast out to more people. So please, if you haven't yet, please give us those 5 stars and those reviews on Apple and Spotify. And if you love watching your podcast on YouTube, please like and subscribe there as well. All right, moment number 3. This is going to be our last moment. And it was the night that I realized that I was still running, right? I was still running. And this third moment was almost the hardest to swallow, because it was about 2 years after the first moment that I had described. Maybe, 2 to 3 years after. And on the outside, I looked totally better in a lot of ways, right? Physically, energetically, I wasn't binging the way I used to. I wasn't having those full out of body, nights making runs to the supermarket anymore. I was eating more naturally, intuitively, right? The intuitive eating was kind of like a natural outcome of how I had taught myself to behave with myself. I had lost some weight, but when I really was honest, on the inside, I wasn't feeling free, right? I was feeling tight, because I had traded one kind of chaos for another, and I was once again living a certain type of lie. And this lie was restricting, managing. Whereas I used to binge to escape the feeling of wanting to, leave my skin and stuff. Now I was restricting. I didn't want to leave my skin as much because I felt like I was connected to myself more. But I was being overly careful. I was being quote unquote good. I was being clean. I was worried about the shoe dropping. I was worried about something bad happening to me, right? I wasn't spiraling like I was, earlier, in those other moments, but I also wasn't relaxed, right? I also wasn't relaxed. Every food choice, it still felt loaded. Every meal still carried a lot of pressure. I was hyper vigilant with myself. I was micromanaging myself. I wasn't trusting myself. And underneath, there was this constant, B-roll of keep it together. You don't want to lose this, stay in control. And, one day after, a long day of continuing to just do my life, and I found myself, standing in front of my fridge again. Right? Not hungry, just exhausted from holding myself together, from this invisible pressure that I was putting on myself, right? This pressure of perfection, to not lose this, to not lose how I feel about myself, like I wasn't the one in control. And, I realized something that stopped me cold in my tracks, which was I was still entangled in a toxic relationship with food, right? Before I used it to escape my skin, to numb out. Now I was using control to feel safe, to feel like I'm secure, like I'm going to stay this way. Like, this feeling I have about myself is something that I need to be overprotective of. So it was a different behavior, but it was the same wound, right? I still didn't feel secure in my body. I still didn't feel empowered. I still felt somewhat out of control. As I was standing in the kitchen in front of the fridge, I remember instead of actually eating the food, I remember I sat down on the kitchen floor and I cried, right? I basically just let myself just feel the pressure. It's like I let the pressure just collapse on me, and I cried, right? Because I realized that I was afraid of what I'd feel without the focus being on the food. I was afraid of what I'd feel like. I was, at the time I was single in, New York City. I was 29 years old. I had just opened my yoga studio 2 or 3 years before that and was still trying to make it work. There was so much pressure that I had on myself to have it together, to be impressive, to be composed, also to find a partner. There was just so much that was going on for me. And, and I was now very present to my wants, my desires, a lot of the work I had done before, but I still wasn't comfortable being relaxed about things. I didn't trust. I didn't trust. And so I just let myself say like, all right, I'm surrendering. There was this surrender energy and I cried. I just remember this so clearly. I cried, and not in like a clean way. It was like legit ugly crying, right? Ugly crying. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to be regulated. I was just being really honest with myself. And that's when I understood that this food thing was a messenger, right? This engagement and this dynamic with food was a messenger, and healing my relationship with it wasn't about eating differently. It was about learning how to be with myself without armor. It was learning how to be relaxed with myself, learning how to be relaxed with myself without rules, without control, without needing to hyper focus on food to feel safe. On food or my body, or like, as the biggest anchor to ground me. And that was the real work, right? That was the real work. It was learning how to stay in all of these moments. These were my 3 moments. The moment that I realized that food was managing emotions I didn't have tools for. The moment that I learned I could trust myself. I didn't have to listen to the voices and the urge. And the moment that I stopped running and I started to receive and started feeling, right? And these moments, like you'll see, they often were like just me and myself. They weren't dramatic. They weren't polished. They weren't, these crazy cinematic things. They were just real. They were real for me, but they changed everything. They changed everything for me. So if you see yourself in any of these moments, right? If you're tired of fighting food, if you're tired of micromanaging yourself, if you're tired of being quote unquote good, but you're never really feeling that like exhale, that peace, just know that you're not broken and it can change. You can totally change by just starting to use your life as an opportunity to shift. All right. So that is all. That is all I have for you today. Once again, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, I'm Alana, and thank you for listening to Emotional Eating Unwrapped.